On television, everyone loved the funny uncle on Full House, but the man behind the jokes was hiding a much darker real life. While ABC paid him to be the perfect role model for children, Coulier was secretly navigating a messy divorce and a deeply unequal relationship with a teenage Alanis Morissette. It was a quiet Hollywood secret until she exposed everything on global radio. The late 1980s and early 1990s television landscape was dominated by a rigid, inescapable binary. You were either a paragon of absolute moral purity, fit to sell cereal and family values during prime time, or you were a cautionary tale splashed across the checkout magazines. There was zero tolerance for human error, complexity, or nuance. The ABC network had built an unprecedented empire on a programming block known as TGIF. At the absolute beating heart of this commercial juggernaut was a show about a widowed father raising 3 daughters with the help of his brother-in-law and his best friend. Who controlled the rules of this specific game? The network executives and the major advertisers. They demanded a highly specific, immutable product, domestic conflict that could be neatly introduced, unpacked, and resolved in exactly 22 minutes, culminating in a hug and a soft piano melody. Dave Coulier, born in Detroit in 1959, was not inherently a purveyor of soft, family-friendly comedy. He was a deeply gifted working stand-up comedian and a master impressionist. He had spent his early 20s grinding through the unforgiving, smoke-filled comedy club circuits of the American Midwest and Los Angeles. That environment required sharp edges, thick skin, and a willingness to push boundaries just to survive a hostile late-night crowd. His talent was undeniable. He had even come within an inch of securing a coveted spot on the cast of Saturday Night Live in 1986, only to be rejected at the final hurdle because network executives felt his frantic, character-driven style mirrored the already established Dana Carvey too closely. When Coulier landed the role of Joey Gladstone in 1987, he stepped into a financial goldmine, but he also walked straight into a gilded cage. The industry rewarded him with immense life-altering wealth, global recognition, and the kind of job security most actors only dream of. The unspoken condition of this contract was that he entirely neuter his comedic instincts. He was required to be the eternal asexual man-child. The audience wanted a harmless clown, a man who spoke to a wooden puppet named Mr. Woodchuck, and the studio made absolutely certain he delivered exactly that, week after week, year after year. This environment birthed a dangerous, intoxicating illusion of control. Sitcom stars of this era were shielded from reality by a phalanx of handlers, publicists, and studio executives. They often began to believe they were the masters of their own destiny, running their own personal, unstoppable money-printing machines. They walked through life cloaked in the bulletproof vest of their television personas. When every person you meet on the street treats you like their beloved Uncle Joey, it becomes incredibly easy to assume your actions carry no real-world consequences. The studio protected its assets with aggressive efficiency. Minor indiscretions were buried. Unflattering stories were killed before they reached the printing press. The celebrity lived in a heavily padded room constructed entirely out of their own fame. Yet, they were entirely oblivious to the shifting ground beneath their feet. The paparazzi ecosystem was undergoing a vicious, rapid evolution. Throughout the 1980s, celebrity photography was largely confined to red carpets and arranged press junkets. The exchange was transactional and polite. By the early 1990s, the telephoto lens had become a weapon. Photographers were no longer waiting for permission. They were digging through household rubbish bins, bribing restaurant staff, and waiting in unmarked vans out some ID private residences. The pressure to maintain the squeaky clean moralistic image of the television set while navigating a highly scrutinized private life became a suffocating secondary job. The actors thought they held the reins, but they were merely highly paid employees of a corporate structure that would instantly discard them the second they threatened the advertising revenue. The first severe fracture in Coulier's perfect public facade occurred away from the studio lights. In 1990, amidst the blinding peak of the show's popularity, Coulier married Jane Modine, a successful model and actress he had met when she guest starred on his set. That same year, they welcomed a son, Luke. To the outside world, the television uncle had finally built his own perfect nuclear family. The reality behind closed doors was vastly different. By 1992, after barely 2 years, the marriage collapsed entirely. They divorced with a suddenness that sent shock waves through their immediate circle. Coulier was 33 years old. He was suddenly a single father navigating the emotional wreckage of a failed marriage, burdened with custody arrangements and legal paperwork, while simultaneously sitting at the absolute zenith of American television fame. The psychological toll was immense. He was required to show up on set every single morning, bury his personal trauma, put on brightly colored shirts, and make millions of children laugh with funny voices. The studio's public relations apparatus immediately swung into action. A messy, painful divorce did not align with the brand values of Friday night family viewing. The narrative was quietly managed, smoothed over, and suppressed from the mainstream narrative. The audience was never allowed to see the exhaustion in the actors' eyes. They were not permitted to associate the man making Popeye noises with the grim reality of alimony and broken vows. The machine protected the product, ensuring the veneer remained spotless. This intense isola tie-in, this jarring disconnect between a bleeding personal life and a mandated public cheerfulness, created a profound vulnerability. Coulier was adrift, heavily insulated by his fame, but emotionally hollowed out by the sudden implosion of his family life. He was a man standing on the edge of a personal precipice, entirely unaware that the most defining, destructive, and immortalizing relationship of his life was waiting for him just across the Canadian border. The physical escape from the suffocating Los Angeles studio system often took the form of celebrity sports. In 1992, an all-star charity hockey game in Canada provided Coulier with a temporary reprieve from the wreckage of his swift divorce. He was back in his element, surrounded by athletes far removed from the pristine attic of the Tanner household. Standing on the ice, waiting for the game to commence, he watched an 18-year-old girl step up to the microphone to deliver the Canadian national anthem. Her name was Alanis Morissette. At that precise moment, she was trapped in a completely different, yet equally oppressive sector of the entertainment machine. Raised in Ottawa, she had been thrust into the Canadian pop music industry as a young teenager. By 1991, she had released her debut album, a collection of highly synthesized, manufactured dance pop tracks that yielded a few domestic hits. The Canadian record label executives had carefully packaged her as a harmless bubblegum teen idol, dictating her wardrobe, her sound, and her public persona. She was 18, legally an adult, but entirely beholden to a music industry that viewed young women as disposable commodities. As the musical landscape rapidly shifted in the early 1990s, pivoting towards the raw, abrasive sounds of grunge and alternative rock, her label began to view her as obsolete. She was desperately trying to shed the plastic pop princess image, fighting for the autonomy to write her own lyrics and express the actual turbulence of her transition into adulthood. The executives responded with closed doors and dwindling support. She was fighting for her professional survival, entirely aware that the system was preparing to discard her. The collision of these two trajectories created a profound structural imbalance. When they began dating shortly after the hockey game, the optics were entirely normalized by the standards of the era. A successful 33-year-old television star dating an 18-year-old aspiring singer barely registered as a blip on the cultural radar. Society granted older, wealthy men absolute leniency in their private lives, while demanding absolute perfection from young women. There are no credible allegations of physical violence or illegal behavior in this relationship. The toxicity was entirely systemic and psychological. The architecture of their dynamic was built on a massive disparity in leverage. Coulier possessed a secure multi-million-dollar contract, an established network of powerful friends, a 2-year-old son from a previous marriage, and the emotional baggage of a man who had already lived a full adult life. Morissette possessed raw talent, a crumbling record deal, and the vulnerability of a teenager stepping into the ruthless ecosystem of Hollywood. She entered his world. She navigated the periphery of the Full House universe, a space where Coulier was the undisputed center of gravity. The industry treats the young partners of powerful men with a specific brand of polite condescension. They are viewed as temporary accessories, required to smile, remain quiet, and seamlessly integrate into the established star's routine. The relationship stretched across 2 years, from 1992 to 1994, a critical period of development for an 18-year-old. While Coulier continued to deliver lines to a laugh track, insulated from financial worry, Morissette was absorbing the harsh realities of her precarious position. She was witnessing the mechanics of Hollywood power firsthand. She saw how easily problems were made to disappear for men of a certain status. She experienced the quiet dismissals, the casual invalidation of her emotions, and the crushing weight of being a secondary character in someone else's narrative. Their private interactions were marked by specific intimate routines that would later become historical artifacts. They shared an inside joke, a comedic routine involving a limp, lifeless handshake, dubbed the dead fish. These small, seemingly innocuous details formed the texture of a relationship that was slowly suffocating her. She was attempting to forge an identity as a serious, uncompromising artist, yet she was tethered to a man whose entire public existence relied on broad, sanitized comedy. The friction was inevitable. Coulier viewed the relationship through the lens of a man seeking stability and distraction after a failed marriage. He expected compliance and ease. Morissette was experiencing the violent internal awakening of an artist realizing her own worth. The music industry was telling her to stay quiet and sing the pop songs. Her personal life was requiring her to stay quiet and play the supportive girlfriend. The pressure was building against a fault line that was destined to crack. As 1993 bled into 1994, the facade of the relationship began to disintegrate. The compromises required to sustain the connection became too costly for Morissette to bear. She refused to be permanently relegated to the shadow of a sitcom star. She was compiling the raw data of her experiences, the condescension, the broken promises, the stark realization that the man she loved viewed her pain as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. the music industry simultaneously delivered its final blow. MCA Records Canada dropped her. At 19 years old, she was commercially irrelevant in her home country, carrying the stigma of a failed teen pop star and romantically entangled in a deteriorating relationship that offered no emotional saf. Edie Net. The system had successfully stripped her of her platform, her income, and her voice. The separation was swift and asymmetrical. When the relationship finally severed in 1994, the Hollywood machine ensured Coulier landed softly. He returned to the secure, brightly lit soundstage of Full House, entering the final season of a television juggernaut. His public image remained entirely pristine. The media did not ask questions. The executives did not care about the collateral damage left in his wake, so long as he hit his marks and delivered the catchphrases. He moved forward, entirely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed a fiercely intelligent, broken-hearted artist the exact ammunition she needed to burn the entire system to the ground. Morissette was left standing in the ashes. She had no record label, dwindling finances, and the devastating emotional clarity that comes from being discarded by a man holding all the power. The industry expected her to vanish quietly. They expected her to return to Ottawa defeated, another casualty of a machine that consumes young women and spits them out before their 20th birthday. They drastically underestimated the lethal combination of absolute desperation and unadulterated talent. She packed her bags and moved to Los Angeles, stepping directly into the belly of the beast that had protected the man who broke her heart. She was entirely alone, operating without a safety net, carrying a notebook filled with the unfiltered, vicious truth of her last 2 years. The polite, manufactured pop princess was dead. The survivor who emerged in California was armed, dangerous, and completely out of options. Alanis Morissette arrived in Los Angeles in 1994. The reality of the city immediately stripped away any remaining illusions. She was a 19-year-old immigrant with a voided resume and rapidly draining bank accounts. Within weeks of arriving in California, she was held at gunpoint and robbed on a Los Angeles street, losing the little cash she possessed. The physical violence of the city perfectly mirrored her professional reality. She began sleeping on floors and couches, living out of a suitcase, attending meetings with record executives who looked at her with blank corporate indifference. In 1994, the American music industry demanded polished pop acts. Executives dismissed Morissette's rough demos as unviable, requiring artists to bury their personal trauma for marketability. Completely isolated in Los Angeles and blacklisted by mainstream gatekeepers, she had one remaining option: finding a blind spot in the corporate machinery. That blind spot materialized in the San Fernando Valley, inside a small, unassuming studio owned by producer Glenn Ballard. Ballard was an established industry veteran. He had written hits for Michael Jackson and Paula Abdul. On paper, he represented the exact polished pop machinery Morissette was actively fleeing. But Ballard did something unprecedented for a man in his position during that era. He stopped talking and listened. He left her voice unfiltered, entirely ignoring the industry standard of protecting male egos. Their first session functioned as a forensic extraction of her trauma. They wrote and recorded in real time, operating completely off the grid. There were no focus groups. There was no A&R executive dictating the tempo or censoring the vocabulary. The studio microphone became a confessional, a weapon, and the site of an unraveling. The lyrics poured out of her notebooks. The lyrics were brutally, uncomfortably literal. She documented the cross in the bedroom, the specific sexual encounters in a cinema, the broken promises, and the absolute humiliation of being swiftly replaced by an older partner. It was a meticulous accounting of a power imbalance. She was naming the violence of a quiet discarding. The track was cut in a single visceral vocal take. In the raw audio, you can hear the breath catching in her throat, the breaking of the high. Notes the sheer physical exertion of her fury. Ballard left the recording entirely raw. He refused to smooth out the edges or auto-tune the pain out of the performance. When they finished the demo for what would become the opening volley of her new identity, they possessed a cassette tape containing a highly volatile explosive. It was unmarketable by every metric of the 1994 music industry. It was far too aggressive for pop radio, and the alternative rock stations were strictly dominated by men in flannel shirts, singing about their own apathy. Every major record label in Los Angeles passed on the demo tape. It was universally deemed too angry, too vindictive, and commercially radioactive. Eventually, the cassette landed on the desk of Guy Oseary, a notoriously aggressive young executive at Maverick Records. Maverick was a boutique label co-founded by Madonna, built outside the traditional corporate structure, and specifically designed to take risks on artists the mainstream deemed unpalatable. Oseary put the tape into his stereo. Oseary immediately recognized a generational rupture. He signed her almost instantly. She was given a meager budget and absolute unprecedented creative control. The executives at ABC and the PR handlers protecting Dave Coulier were entirely unaware that thousands of miles away, an unpolished, furious record was being mastered. The television star continued to read his lines, secure in the belief that the past was buried. They were all about to learn a brutal lesson in media physics. Silencing a young woman in private guarantees she will scream in public. In June 1995, Maverick Records quietly released Jagged Little Pill. They sent the lead single, You Ought to Know, to modern rock radio stations. There was no massive marketing campaign. There were no focus groups preparing the audience. The song simply hit the airwaves like a sledgehammer. The impact was immediate and seismic. It tore through the cultural landscape, obliterating the polite bow and dairies that had confined female artists for decades. Listeners jammed the phone lines of radio stations demanding to know who the singer was. The song was unpolished, vicious, and completely devoid of the polite femininity the industry usually demanded. The album went on to sell over 33 million copies worldwide, sweeping the Grammy Awards and permanently altering the trajectory of popular music. The media, sensing blood in the water, immediately launched a ruthless, frantic manhunt. The public demanded a target. They needed to know who the villain of this story was. Tabloids offered bounties for the identity of the man who had inspired such monumental rage. The industry machine, which had previously ignored her, now sought to monetize her anger by turning it into a cheap celebrity guessing game. The true twist lies in how the revelation unfolded. The collision occurred in an entirely mundane setting. Dave Coulier was driving his car on a highway in Detroit. The song came on the local radio station. He heard the aggressive, distorted bass line. He heard the hook. He recognized the distinctive vocal tone. And then he heard the lyrics. Does she speak eloquently? And would she have your baby? I'm sure she'd make a really excellent mother. He pulled the car over to the side of the road. He drove to a nearby record store, purchased the CD, and sat alone in his parked car, listening to the entire album from start to finish. He heard the lyric about the dead fish, the specific, intimate inside joke about a limp handshake that only two people in the world shared. The architecture of his safety collapsed inside that vehicle. He realized he was the villain. The media assumed the target of the song must be a monster, a violent Hollywood predator who had committed unspeakable acts. The reality was much more mundane and far more insidious. He was just a careless older man who had leveraged his power, deeply hurt a young woman who was entirely out of her depth, and assumed he would, never have to answer for it. Ooh, Coulier later admitted to the press, recalling that exact moment in the car. I think I may have really hurt this woman. The public and the press expected a messy, prolonged tabloid war. That is the standard protocol for the entertainment industry. They expected Coulier to deny the relationship, to smear Morissette's character, or for Morissette to cash in on his famous name by granting exclusive paid interviews. That is how the machine usually profits from a crisis. It feeds on the conflict, but Morissette executed a brilliant silent rebellion. In the days, months, and decades that followed, she point-blank refused to publicly confirm his name. She never explicitly validated the rumors to the press. When journalists ambushed her, she stared them down and stated that the song was about her own experience, not about giving a man a platform. By refusing to name him, she denied the media the cheap gossip they craved. She elevated the song from a petty celebrity squabble into a universal anthem for female survival. This supposed breakdown was not a failure. It was a flawlessly executed escape. She took her pain, monetized it on her own absolute terms, and completely locked the oppressive system out of the narrative. The fires of the immediate cultural explosion eventually burned themselves out, leaving a permanently altered entertainment landscape in their wake. When the dust finally settled on 1995, the casualties and the victors were counted, but the true nature of the fallout revealed a deeply cynical reality about the machinery of fame. The system did not break. It simply absorbed the rebellion and found a way to monetize the wreckage. For Dave Coulier, survival meant carrying a permanent, invisible albatross. He did not lose his career, nor was he exiled from the industry. The patriarchal safety net of the 1990s television apparatus functioned exactly as designed. A man in his position was afforded the grace of a quiet retreat. He finished his lucrative tenure on Full House, which aired its final episode the same year Jagged Little Pill was tearing through the charts. He transitioned into voiceover work safely hidden behind animation cells, insulated from the immediate glare of the paparazzi. He continued to work, continued to earn, and continued to live a life of privilege. Yet he could never entirely outrun the ghost of that vocal take. In every interview, in every press junket for the rest of his natural life, the shadow of the song lingered. He was reduced from the beloved television uncle to a cultural punchline. The man who was so thoroughly dismantled on a global scale that his very existence became synonymous with a bad breakup. It was a unique, psychological purgatory. He was not canceled, but he was eternally branded. To his credit, as the decades passed and the immediate sting faded, Coulier adopted a stance of quiet resignation and eventual grace. He did not retaliate. When pressed by journalists years later, long after the media circus had moved on to fresh blood, he spoke of Morissette with a measured, undeniable respect. He publicly called her brilliant. He acknowledged her immense generational talent. He even expressed a strange melancholic pride in having been a catalyst, however clumsy and destructive his role had been, for a masterpiece that defined a decade. They eventually reconnected in private, clearing the air finding a mature, quiet peace long after the executives had stopped counting the receipts. Coulier built a stable life away from the blinding center of the spotlight, eventually remarrying, launching podcasts, and recently surviving a severe battle with cancer, emerging into remission. He survived the machine. Alanis Morissette conversely ascended to a terrifying new echelon of power. She swept the Grammy Awards. She broke international sales records. But more importantly, she altered the fundamental DNA of popular music. She forced the gates open for an entire generation of female artists, proving to the corporate gatekeepers that female rage was not just a viable demographic, but an overwhelmingly lucrative one. She dictated her own terms, fiercely guarding her publishing rights and her creative autonomy. However, the darkest truth of this entire saga lies not in the heartbreak of two individuals, but in the reaction of the corporate superstructure. The executives who profited from Coulier's pristine, sanitized image on the ABC network were cut from the exact same cloth as the executives who profited from Morissette's unadulterated trauma on MTV. The Hollywood system operates exclusively on a balance sheet. It is entirely agnostic to the source of revenue, existing solely to price human experience, package it, and consume it until nothing remains. Morissette's rebellion, as pure and authentic as it was immediately commodified. Record labels spent the next 5 years desperately trying to clone her, signing hundreds of young women, instructing them to wear flannel and act angry, completely missing the point that the power lay in the authenticity, not the aesthetic. Female empowerment simply became another marketing strategy. Dave Coulier and Alanis Morissette represent two violently clashing eras of fame, trapped in the same historical intersection. Coulier was the ultimate polished product of the 20th century studio system, a man paid millions of dollars to suppress his true nature and hide his human flaws behind a synthetic laugh track. Morissette was the harbinger of a new volatile era, one that realized authenticity, even an ugly, jagged authenticity, held far more psychological power than corporate perfection. The 1990s demanded that its television stars be saints, which mathematically guaranteed they would eventually be exposed as sinners. That specific, rigid studio system of TGIF sitcoms is now dead and buried, but the architecture of exploitation did not disappear. It merely evolved. The cages are no longer built by network executives in boardrooms in Burbank. They are built by the subjects themselves. Today, the panopticon of social media demands the exact same impossible duality. The modern industry requires the constant, exhausting curation of a flawless aesthetic, while simultaneously demanding the weaponized exposure of personal trauma for audience engagement. The meat grinder simply upgraded its blades. If Dave Coulier was lucky enough to survive the collision between his private failures and his public persona, managing to step away, build a quiet life, and eventually find peace with the wreckage of his past, he was the exception, not the rule. At the exact same time, in another, much darker corner of the 1990s television landscape, another young star found themselves trapped in an even more vicious iteration of the machine. A machine that did not just demand a piece of their dignity, but actively orchestrated their isolation. And when that particular star tried to find the exit door, they discovered too late that the system does not allow its most valuable assets to simply walk away. A quiet night, a dark road, and a death perfectly disguised as an unavoidable accident. The camera slowly pans back to where this narrative began, the brightly lit, meticulously staged attic of the Tanner household. The laugh track is muted now. The studio audience has gone home. The bright primary colors of the 1990s set design feel hollow, artificial, and intensely claustrophobic. We are looking at a crime scene where no physical crime was committed, but where a profound psychological toll was extracted from everyone who stepped in front of the lens. We, the audience, were the final necessary component of this machine. The network executives and the record label heads did not build this crushing apparatus in a vacuum. They built it to satisfy a demand. Millions of televisions tuned in every Friday night because we demanded the comfort of a flawless, uncomplicated family unit. We financed the gilded cage that trapped Dave Coulier, and years later, when the illusion shattered, we rushed to the record stores to purchase the sonic documentation of that very destruction. We funded the sitcom, and we funded the rebellion. The entertainment industry simply acted as the broker, collecting the revenue from both the creation of the facade and its inevitable violent demolition. The legacy of this specific collision is not merely a trivia question about a famous breakup. It is a historical blueprint of how power operates in the shadows of the spotlight. It is a testament to the absolute ruthlessness required to survive an industry that views human beings as depreciating assets. Alanis Morissette did not just write a song. She exposed the architecture of a system that relied entirely on the silence of young women. She proved that the only way to beat a rigged game is to flip the board entirely. As the image of the sitcom addict fades to black, it is replaced by a single static photograph of Coulier from 1995. He is caught off guard by a paparazzi flash, the wide manufactured grin entirely absent from his face. He looks exhausted. He looks like a man who has finally realized the terrifying cost of his own fame. Uncle Joey made the entire world grin with a harmless catchphrase. But it was Dave Coulier, the man behind the mask, who gave a fiercely intelligent, broken-hearted 18-year-old the ammunition to make the entire world sing along to the angriest, most defining rock anthem of the decade. That is the darker real life hiding silently behind the cut-it-out smile. The machine never stops running. It only changes its disguise. If this autopsy of the 1990s fame machine shifted your perspective, ensure you subscribe and leave a comment below. How much of the entertainment we consume today is still built on this exact same invisible power imbalance? Do we still demand our celebrities to be flawless, only to feast on their inevitable coal? Apps, stay subscribed, because in our next dossier, we are leaving the brightly lit sound stages of network television and descending into the genuine lethal darkness of the late 20th century. If Dave Coulier survived the Hollywood machine, another rising star was quietly targeted by an entity far more dangerous than a public relations team. We will examine the forensic evidence, the altered police reports, and the chilling reality of a highly coordinated assassination that the authorities officially recorded as a tragic, unavoidable accident. The tape is cued. We will see you in the next investigation.